Hello everybody! I'm Dari with NEKLO, and today I have a very special guest. Meet John Szabo, an IT executive turned high school teacher. So, yes, previously John held several tech VP roles with BNY Mellon, where he was responsible for business process automation and led multiple teams. Then he spent several years with health tech and insurance tech startups and later on joined an Indian software powerhouse. But then everything changed. Now he is a New York University teacher resident with Washington Latin Public Charter School, and he teaches calculus, pre-calculus, and AP computer science. So, let's speak with John and find out more about his transition. Hi John, how are you?
I'm doing great, Jerry. Thanks for having me here.
Oh, absolutely. I checked, it's been 8 years since our last conversation. And when I learned about the news of your career change, I couldn't help but inviting you here just because I'm so full of questions.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here and to share kind of my journey that my transition, my transformation out of one area to another.
Sure. So let's start with the most important one, the most logical one, I'd say. You worked with big and small IT companies. You changed processes, you restructured teams, you drove client satisfaction, value, whatnot. Now you teach advanced maths and computer science to high school kids. And that kind of looks a bit suspicious to me. So could you tell me what happened?
Yeah, people often think this was like a complete career change, but I don't always see it that way. Like I see this transition as almost a logical flow into what I was doing with IT and getting into a more personal way of experiencing things that will be more meaningful for me. So, throughout my 30 years in technology, you know, leadership that I had, I was always teaching. I was mentoring employees, coaching teams, and developing future leaders. So, and always helping people solve complex problems and solutions, but like in a different environment.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I got further into my career, I started asking myself kind of the bigger question about, how can I make a more impactful and, in a different way to be more impactful, having something that's more meaningful. What I felt like what I was almost at the end of my I don't know, motivational factor of being there for 30 years. I just needed something meaningful in my next 10 to 15 years. So, I also spent years advocating for, neurodivergent students, and adults. I realized that, education was where I could combine my love of learning, mathematics, technology, computer science, and service to others. So it's not about the higher level in a corporation, and it's not about my salary at this point. But so I'm near 60 years old, I was like, I had left the corporate, this corporate career. I went back to graduate school. I hadn't even before going back to NYU for my my master's in teaching. I went to get my doctorate in education. So I knew my path was going to end up at a school somewhere. So I went to NYU, just graduated a couple of weeks ago, just completed my capstone.
Congratulations.
Yeah. So I'm excited about that. And actually last week, and, became a teacher. So it wasn't about leaving like something behind for me. It was about, moving towards something, like I said, more meaningful. But before this, I said that I received this degree in education. I knew during COVID that I was transitioning. During the period of COVID, we were home. I started to figure out what that was going to be for me. And as I transition out of the corporate life. So teaching has been the hardest job I've had, but it's also been the most rewarding. So it's a path that I'm excited about because I only have a year experience, but a lot of experience that, supports me going into this next phase.
Well, first of all, I would never say you're 60. And secondly, this transition is indeed very impressive. I sometimes think about our purpose in life, and I realize that only a few of us will actually be remembered beyond 150 years after their death. And fortunately or unfortunately, 99% nobody will remember your or my IT projects. But the impact you can make on those kids today, neurotypical, neurodivergent, this has a chance of surviving that 150-year gap, and you will be remembered by your actions and by your impact.
And that's what inspires me, right? So it's the kids, and they're just very open, right? So there's no hiding what they're saying. They're just upfront, so you know exactly what you're getting, and you have an opportunity to maybe impact and change or help them discover what their path is, or help them towards something that is not like in my generation where my parents were like, yeah, this is what you need to do. This is why you're going to school. We want you to do this, right? So instead of like me being passionate about something, how I inspire my daughters, like, you got to do what you love. So I'm hoping to bring that aspect too into the schools, not just teaching them math, teaching them comp sci, but life experiences through what I've seen,
For sure. And kids are also the most honest listeners. Like there are a lot of those courses about active listening, like you have to say, yes, yeah, I'm with you there. But kids, if it's not interesting, if they're not impressed, they won't give a damn. But then if this is what lands with them, they will be the most thankful.
And they will call you out. So they will know that you are, somehow not upfront with them. If you're trying to, just like in the business world, right? When you're trying to talk through technology and you don't know it, that's going to be called out. So.
Yeah. And this was actually my next question. I'm sure this corporate IT world is not entirely out of your heart, not entirely behind you. So can you draw any parallels between managing business critical software projects and teaching high school kids?
Yeah, so I mean, more similarities than people might even think,
Oh, let's hear.
Yeah, so like, in both environments, you're working with people, right, who have different strengths, different needs, and different ways of learning and communicating. So my class that I taught this year in math, we have students that need some modifications, maybe adjustments in how we're teaching in a class or how they're taking a test. There are students that are neurodivergent, so they have, special needs that really need to be focused on. So extra time of testing, or, really sitting with them one-on-one, very similar to in a business, right? So you're mentoring, you're having one-on-ones with your team, you're managing through their difficulties and helping them through those times. So very similar, right? So taking those skill sets and processes that have been built in the corporate world, you can easily transfer that into, education and into the classroom. So like a good, project manager doesn't simply manage the technology, or even the timeline, but they build trust, right? So you're removing obstacles, you're creating conditions for people to succeed. And teaching is very similar. So you don't want a student to fail, right? You don't want them to even get a D. You want them to pass and understand the math. So there's extra time that goes into, with students that may need that additional help. So it's not putting, like in the corporate world, putting someone on a, plan to help them get to, improvements, but you're really sitting down with a student and really need to understand what their strengths are and difficulties, and guide them, help them through the math, mentoring and spending that extra time. So sometimes it's more time than in the business world that you do spend with your team, because you're kind of spending with your team, you're going off to another project, and there's a time frame around that, even a time frame to have your employee to succeed in some way and get them back on the right track, where education is going to be lifetime, so lifetime impact. So you are impressing something that is very meaningful, can be very meaningful to a student, and how they lead or go into the business or whatever they want to do after classes and school, if that's college or if it's going into a trade.
And has your work-life balance changed? Do you spend more time at work or compared to the IT times, or vice versa?
Well, I think it's a different time spent. Like, I need to learn the math, so it's like I could close my eyes and I know IT and I understand it. You could talk the jargon and all that, and I could draw something on the board. Where math for me was to kind of go back many years and kind of relearn. I was teaching calculus and pre-calc, and then AP is advanced comp sci class. So comp sci was not an issue. I understood it, but it was like the math that I needed to kind of spend time at night learning it, going through the problems. So when the next day when I was teaching the class, I knew what I was doing, especially the homework. We would start up with a warm-up practice problem from anything that we learned prior. We would do like a startup of the class. So here's a problem, maybe 2 or 3 problems. They would spend the first 15 minutes of the class to kind of going through it. We go through it, and then we learn something new. And so I needed to really be ready for that, and for multiple ways, right? So you're not always ready for things. Just like in the IT world, you may not be ready for what may happen during the day or a question that comes up. So you also have to plan for things like that, like misconceptions, things that you may think that a student may move towards the solution of a problem during class. So you have to kind of be prepared for that so that you can respond appropriately. And I was not always ready. So I would take that back, just like in business. It's a checklist for something for the next day to kind of go back to that one. So very similar, methods, I guess, is used. I use, into the classroom.
And what about the weekends? Like when you were in IT, were you completely switched off, or did you take projects on the weekend when something was, there was a deadline or something had to be done?
Yeah. I mean, if there was step 1, step 2, step, there was an issue, you had to be on a call. So yeah, there was always some sort of work on the weekends that I needed to focus on, but not always, right? So I always try to bring that work-life balance into, especially the weekends. I mean, just like in anything, if there was stuff preparing for Sunday, but teaching was a little bit different because I was going to school. So I had class and work during the weekends. So I had to, get that work done and plan for that Monday, that week before. So there was planning that needed to be done for the school day, starting Monday. There was homework that I needed to prepare for NYU, and classes I had throughout the week that were due either Sunday night or Saturday night. So always busy. So I'm welcoming some sort of downtime. I'm going to definitely want to work that in, that work-life balance. But part of it is you got to plan for that, right? So the schools I've been at are very focused on having that work-life balance, but your Sundays are preparing for your Mondays. So, so there's that extra time, but I enjoy it because I think doing problems and doing the math, and it helps me kind of just jigger some things that, that probably laid in the back of my brain for many years, and they're still there. So it's amazing how you kind of regenerate that knowledge in math.
And gives you satisfaction, probably.
Yeah, it does, because I think learning, and especially in education, and just learning like a language, and you're developing something new, programming, whatever the case may be. Yeah, it's satisfaction that it's working, that you got the problem right, and you impacted, a student's life somehow, that they got it. So it's the greatest feeling is when they're like, oh my God, I think I understand what you're talking about.
So I imagine you're a bit drained after this academic year, but still pretty satisfied and rewarded.
Yeah, you definitely get drained. You definitely, like, I would come home and I would just crash. Yeah, it was like you crash and you sleep for a little bit just to kind of regenerate yourself and then go back to it. And then coming in, like walking to the school is definitely different than walking into the corporate world, where sometimes you would walk down the hallways and not everyone is the most friendly in the corporate world. They just don't make I'm one that have to make eye contact with you. I'm like, my hand's like in your face. And if you don't see me, that becomes not an issue, but I'm like, well, that interpersonal thing is just not going to work out. Where at the school, they see you. It's amazing how the students, when they get to know you, feel comfortable with you and trust you. It's like, high-fiving and fist bumping in the hallway and hearing your name, so it's definitely a more satisfying, experience than where I came from.
Because they're more genuine yet.
Yeah, and they don't have a lot of life experiences, and they trust you, and they're trying to build a relationship with you, because plus they're also knowing that you're going to give them a grade too. But it's more than that. It's, like I coached a little bit, so it's seeing them outside the classroom, meeting their parents, developing relationships outside the classroom. So, and that goes a long way.
Yeah, this is super important. So, speaking about the students' names, you mentioned about the naming. You taught about 75 kids this academic year. Did you always remember all of their names?
Well, eventually, yes. So, that was the first thing that my mentor, and there was also like an NYU teacher residence. It was like the director who was like my manager from NYU. So yeah, eventually I knew everyone's name, but first it was definitely challenging because I had, multiple classrooms. I was also sitting in classrooms observing that I didn't teach, but I needed to, get to know the names. So, I made it a priority because a student's name is part of their identity, right? So, being known and recognizing, matters to me, but also to them, because you're seeing them, right? You're seeing, hey, their name, you know them, and that's a good feeling, right? And just like in the corporate business, world, I came from where names are like hugely, important to someone's, like I said, someone's identity and being seen. If it's in a conference room, in a hallway, but like in the classroom and outside the classroom. So I used like seating charts, greeting students at the door, and I, just simply talking to them, every day. So, making a point to have a, outside of a math type of situation or a comp sci situation, but talk about how their day was, and how the game went, or, maybe if the Knicks won or not, so. But when a teacher knows your name, there's something about, who you are, and it helps create that trust and sense of belonging. So trust is important, that relationships. I believe in relationship building, in the corporate world, and bringing that into the classroom. So that was like my first thing. I always say that, like, to my mentors, it's the most important thing for me is building that relationship. And they always, I don't know, for whatever reason, they were a 50-50 split. They believed in it, and sometimes they didn't, because I think some of my mentors had taught for like 20, 30 years, some maybe just recently, so they may see that relationship a little bit differently than I do, coming from the corporate world. But, and then occasionally, I mixed up a name, early in the year, And by the end, I knew every student and their, individual personalities. I remember it was the middle of class and going through a lesson, and I called upon a student, and his name was Liam, but I call him Leo for whatever reason. Leo is someone in another class, but I made it a point. So when there was a student who started giggling because they knew I messed up on the name at the point, I made it a point, like, and it just I was like, damn, I think I messed up that student's name. So after that, I took him aside and said, Liam, I will never. I never will forget your name. I will never do that again. And he was cool, definitely cool about it. But I made it a point to let him know that, your name is important. I will not call you Leo again. So, but yeah, I mean, identity, names, just like in the business world. Like I don't know how many times I've been, called Tom or Joe or something like that. And I'm like, sometimes I correct, the person, or sometimes I just let it go. But in the classroom, early on, it's important to know who's in your classroom.
Yeah, for sure. I have a trouble remembering names. So if I'm on a meeting and there are a lot of people, well, more than 5 is already a lot of, I draw sketches of those persons, like somebody has a beard, somebody has eyeglasses, then I draw their positioning relative to each other and names. And this makes it, sometimes maybe I look stupid, like Lindsay. Something like this. But yeah, with kids who are genuine and they want this recognition of them as a personality, and this name is a pure manifestation of such recognition by an adult. This is super important.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Now let's discuss neurodiverse classes. So you mentioned you teach neurodiverse classes, and they have become more and more widespread, are becoming more and more widespread. In a neurodiverse class, each kid has their own unique needs, even if it's a neurotypical kid. And my question is this: how do you navigate through the class so that each of the students gets their share of attention, but then everybody progresses within the time limits and everything and other restrictions?
Yeah. So, so I have, so I have a nephew that is neurotypical, neurodiverse. So he was diagnosed at the time. He just turned 30, but with Asperger's. But it's on the spectrum of autism. So, so he inspired me, right? He inspired me in a way to learn and understand before I even got into education. Before I got into what I was going to eventually transition to. It's like his intelligence and sincere conversation changed my life. So, which inspired me to get my doctorate and do my dissertation on his experience in college. His relationships with professors, the relationships he had with students, what needed to happen so that he felt more comfortable, and then the services that were there for him or not there for him were being sought out somehow. But for me, I tried not to think of it as like managing students in that way. Like I think of it as understanding students, that they have their own specific need, whatever that may be. So that's where it goes back to the question before about names and identity and understanding them and getting to trust them in a way that every classroom for me is neurodiverse, right? Because every brain works different. So and the one thing I've learned is that like my nephew may not always want to be identified as someone with a disability. He's proud that he's neurodiverse and he's autistic, but that same, whatever services and how he's being taught in the classroom, there should be no difference from what is being provided to. So that accommodation, that modification should be shared among the class. So if it's extra time on the test and so forth,
for sure,
that's how he saw it, right? So the the students in the classroom understood him more than teachers. So going back to the teacher, I think there's training that needs to happen for every teacher every year to kind of learn what that means to teach in a neurodivergent environment. So some students need more structure. Some need more time to process information. Some learn best by like talking, and others by writing or drawing visually. So there's a visual aspect of it and how they communicate in ways that they understand something that's being taught. So you have to have that flexibility in the class for students to have the ability to represent what they need, and how they communicate within the classroom. But pacing and classroom management are important aspects of effectively managing learning in the class. So because like I said, like every student has their own need and requirement and pace of learning, and you have to recognize that. You have to recognize that before you go into the class. And sometimes when you're teaching something, you may have to kind of reteach things the next day because it just didn't, maybe that lesson just didn't go well, or just needs to be structured a little bit. So my job is to create, multiple pathways for students to succeed. That means, predictable, routines, clear expectations, opportunities for, collaboration and flexibility when they're needed. So like small group discussions, they feel comfortable, talking to the whole class and, being able to present themselves that way. But some students don't. They need, they feel more comfortable maybe on a one-on-one with student to student or in a small group. So, I don't ask really what's some student, teachers do, like what's wrong with the student. I ask, what does the student need in order to learn and thrive? The mindset, the teacher's mindset changes everything. So going into the classroom. So, they see that. When they see that you see them and, providing that extra time across all students, becomes more meaningful, that relationship and trust grows, and you have a better classroom environment.
Yeah, and better relations inside the class. And I think such methods benefit the neurotypical students as well, because they learn to respect, they learn to recognize diversity and spread this attitude among others out of school, in other societies, wherever they will enter.
Yeah, so the one thing in the STEM field, students that are, and I did my dissertation, my research on autism, students that are autistic, and 85%. So there's an 85% unemployment rate in that field, in IT. But most students that are neurotypical go into fields that are STEM related, and let's talk a little about how things have to change. Corporations have to change to identify how to interview, giving them time to explain themselves in multiple different ways. So and they may not, that candidate may not want to self-identify them as having a disability or having, a learning disability of some sort. Corporations, schools have to really understand that student, that candidate, better, and be able to provide, the facilities to interview them properly and teach them properly so that they succeed.
Yeah, I think with the existing support of educational systems in many countries of the inclusion of neurodivergent kids into the class society, companies are still not very much prepared for that. So it's riskier for those children to grow up and try and express themselves in the adult life and make money and a career.
Yeah, and I think it's important to integrate students into like the mainstream classroom. So like I said, I had a student that was neurotypical, and then we have plans called IEPs, which really are a detailed plan of how you're going to teach a student that needs maybe accommodations, modifications, what their specific needs are. And it's a very detailed plan. IP is 504s or more for students that may not need, some modifications and adjustments to, extra time on the test, but they're, given that plan, and it goes through the life of that, once they're identified as a student that needs some support, that plan goes through with them to the end of, high school, and transition. So there's a transition into wherever they go, if it's college or, into the trades or work right after, high school. There's a transition plan to help them through whatever that job navigational piece is.
That's great. That's great. The kids you taught this year, this academic year, they are still considered Zoomers. Zoomers are who nowadays are between 14 and 29 years old. And there are a lot of stories about Zoomers, how they try to cling to their families forever, and some stories like a mom was accompanying her adult Zoomer child to a job interview. So what do you observe with the classes that you led this year? Are kids like more or less focused on the future and career compared to, for example, when you went to high school?
Yeah, I think students face, a very different world and situation than from when I, went to school. Like many are incredibly driven and ambitious. So the school where I was in Latin in Washington, D.C., students were, driven in a way because the school is kind of set up that way to be successful. So, and part of it, they have successful parents in politics and in government. So, being in DC. So, so they're very similar way, driven and ambitious to do something, good. So they're thinking about college, they're thinking about careers. Sometimes they don't know. There's mental health related issues that they're, working through. There's social issues, peer related, challenges, right? So the future, and also, figuring out what that future is, much at a younger age than I think I did. So I don't know if I even knew what I wanted to do, but, at the same time, they're also dealing with enormous, pressure, so from, like I said, the social media, academics doing well to getting into a good school, the uncertainty about their future. And then, that peer pressure is, tremendous. Still, I had peer pressure, but I don't know if it was as crazy as it is now with, especially with things that are on your computer and your phone, texting, where I didn't have any of that, right? So it was either 4 channels on TV. I think, cable was around, but definitely different scenario of TV and how you're consuming, news and media, if it's real or not. So, like I said, when I was like in high school, information moved in a much slower rate. Like your newspaper, nothing was digital, right? So, I read a book. Everything was 500 pounds a book, where, you have a laptop and everything is, online. So, today's students are, consistently connected. They're constantly comparing themselves to others. Some students have a very clear plan that they know what they want to do, and you can see it like in the classroom, while others are still figuring things out. Which is, perfectly okay, but they don't always see it that way because they're comparing themselves to their friends. So I think most teenagers, regardless of, generation, are trying to really answer the same question. And I think I probably had this too. It's like, who am I and where do I, belong, but that hasn't changed, right? So I think, it's very similar, but very different in the way information is shared. Like they're, being presented with a ton more, you want to get into gigabytes and all that of data, more than I ever had, needed to worry about, but still felt that same type of pressure, right? Of being successful. My friend Mike is doing this, well, I better, step it up in some way. But yeah, so definitely different, but same in many ways.
A good advice to kids in this age is don't compare yourself to your peers. Compare to yourself half a year ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's important to focused on the individual. And that's what like teaching, right? You're really focused on the individual, their individual need. And they need to do the same when they're comparing themselves to, their friends or, maybe a celebrity, that they are, or musician that they are, or want to be or want to become. And that's great to have your role models, but you're not to the point where you're comparing where they're at versus where you want to be at. Everyone has their own path. I believe in, that's kind of figured out in some way, like your path in life. It can be jiggered a little bit as you kind of go through life, but I think some of that stuff is already, there for you. You just need to, I don't know. I'm always been very relaxed and chilled on things, but I don't always show, the stress and pressure of, work or even my personal life. I have the same demeanor, but students are just in a different environment. The violence that are, that's happening in schools and being concerned about that. Like I'm in DC where I'm at now, like I'm going from an area where it was very, they had, locked doors and stuff, but, it was easy access. Where I'm going to a school where, they have armed security guards, they have, metal detectors, and they're checking your bags. So, which, is a source of comfort of going into, that environment. And I think that probably provides some comfort for parents, but also it's, a different environment. I didn't have any of that. I walked into my classroom, no one really checked anything. Now they're taking cell phones away. They put them in a little bag and any other electronics, your headphones. You're just, and then they block certain websites during class, right? So you only can see certain things. So definitely different.
Yeah, the more data vetting, the more control. Sure. And one question that that would be normal for me to ask a teacher. A teacher is expected to always be emotionally neutral to all of the students. So during this year, did you get attached to any of them?
Yeah, I mean, so I had a couple students. I had one student that was doing my independent study on. So, and they were in advanced calculus class and was struggling and, probably didn't feel that was, a good fit for them. And, had conversations with their parents, and we decided, so my mentor teacher and myself had a meeting with parents and decided to pull him out. So he's, the student was very quiet, but very smart, right? But just didn't feel comfortable in that competitive environment. So, we did an independent study. So I had a one-on-one session with the student, and in the beginning, it's about building trust, and knowing what works for them. So it was definitely a different, perspective for me. So which I definitely used, for my whole classroom and how to build relationships. So, this independent study really taught me how to teach a whole class because I was really focused on that one student and their needs, but it really meant, something that I could bring into the whole class. So it was learning how to build a relationship with him, personally getting to know what they liked and where they were heading, into college, developing a relationship with his parents. So having some one-on-one sessions with them just to give them feedback and, understand what works well for them. So the parents also is important into, this environment of learning and teaching. So, I developed, a very close relationship with him and with them. And, something I always take on, always remember, because at the end of the school year, he passed me a note, just thanking me and, saying that, not really this, math person, math guy, but you really brought math into my life in a different way. And I appreciate that. And then, so that was meaningful. And then I had another student who was just filled with anxiety, anxiety, not just about math, but about classroom, senior, graduating, getting an A and trying to move on to their next, life, next journey. And at the end of the school year, when I was leaving, the school in Latin, they had the student came up and talked. They would have a student talk about the educator that was leaving, and they talk. So I like the things that they said about me. I would not, would not know. Other than we had this good relationship, there was things that were brought out, like, making math not as complex, enjoyable, reduce the anxiety of learning math, and that's those words and that tribute was unexpected, and I would never see, right? I'm very critical of myself and I don't see these things, but coming from a student, and we built a relationship in that way that I didn't know, because, during classroom, I was trying to, reduce the anxiety and trying to, not put additional pressure on them, but also making the class, challenging, right? So, but then we started talking about, with the student now who's speaking with me, we talked about their likes. They were writing this book, and I started reading their chapters and giving them feedback. So we built like a relationship that was trusting, based on giving feedback that was non-math related. So, and it also goes back to like the relationships that you build and try to build. And that's one way. Like even at work, in the corporate world, you're trying to build relationships outside of the work world. That's why you kind of go out, you have lunch, you kind of trying to, and sometimes you're always talking about business, right? At a off-site thing, but it's a good way to build those trusting relationships, long-term relationships.
Yeah, best contracts are written on a napkin in the bar.
Yeah, and that's like best relationships, right? You're talking differently. You're more relaxed. You're talking about things that you either personal that well, and you're proud of. Like so, this one student's proud about her writing, about their writing, and and that's was meaningful for me too, to kind of learn that.
And maybe your feedback on their book would inspire them to continue, and ultimately you'll see their book selling in bookstores, and maybe they'll receive a Pulitzer's Prize.
Well, and that's funny you say that, because at the end, teachers at the school, there was these notes where you could write something, instead of a yearbook, and you write something in their yearbook. So there's a note with their name, and I went into every student that were graduating that was in my class and wrote them something. And in that one student's note, I wrote about that, like, keep on writing. I want to read, someday as you publish your first book, I will be the first one to buy it, and
awesome.
Good luck, much, success there. So.
This is so much rewarding. And then the speech they gave and the note you received from the other student, I think it's much more valuable than all those, accomplishment certificates you get in IT world for various accomplishments that you people put on the walls behind them.
Yeah, it's funny. And then there is a week during the school where they thank a teacher. And so every student wrote something, not every student, but one student is picked to write something about a teacher in their class, or that they know. And they posted on this wall up on this like area of going up a stair to the next level of the school. And I didn't expect to see mine. And I'm looking, and there I saw my name, and it was written by another student about how, I come in, very chill and, is willing to help. And, the presence of me in classroom just brings down the stress level for whatever reason. So my demeanor is just the way it is. So they wrote this on the board, and I was like, I took that home. Mm-hmm. So before I left, my last day was last week, I took it off the wall and brought it with me. So I have these things that I can post maybe in a classroom or show, hey, I got thank you notes that, shows for me, it's an inspiration for me to kind of keep on going, because there's days where, hey, look, I go from a 30-year career going and teaching for the first year and not knowing anything. Like my confidence is not always there, right? So I'm trying to rebuild that. Even though I have confidence front of the classroom, I don't always have confidence when, being, asked questions, and interacting in that way, so it's, transition, and and we'll go through, I've been told, for the next, several years until, I get to that point.
It's a great teaching career start that you've had.
Yeah.
Okay, John, I'm sure that among the viewers there will be some who may be thinking of a career turn, and maybe they are hesitant for whatever reasons. What advice would you give them?
Well, it's never too late to reinvent yourself. I believe change is great. So throughout my career, I've changed. I don't know if I've ever stayed. I have a friend that stayed at a company for like almost 35 years.
Wow.
Where I've stayed, 2 years, maybe 8 years was probably the longest. Maybe not even 8 years. It was between like consulting and becoming an employee. So a total of 8 years at this place. Probably the most I've ever been. Either it's been 5 years, 2 years, 3 years, maybe a year. But, I changed careers, at almost being, 60. So I love that number, because I think it shows really the breadth of the experience you bring. You can transition at any age. So you don't have to be, my age. You can transition when you're in 40s, your 30s. You can transition early in your career. Like my daughter is 25. She's, doing something that she may not be fully excited about. So I'm like, change is always there. You don't want to be afraid, especially in this environment, to change, learn something new. I think that keeps you going, and definitely, it's definitely for me. I like to learn. I want to be a lifelong learner. Yeah. Because, was it scary? Yeah. So definitely, absolutely trying to figure it out. And, it's easy for me to go like, hop into IT, because as I was going through this journey and looking for my next role, because I'm going to be going to another school to teach math starting next year, I had opportunities to go into the school, but into an IT capacity as a leadership role, which I could eventually do, but I'm not ready to do that. I want to still teach in front of the class. So maybe that is a change in the education piece. Some time to use both my education piece and my IT and bring it into a leadership role at a school somewhere. But the growth, often happens when you're willing to be uncomfortable. Like I'm definitely still uncomfortable in this environment. So my advice would be, be curious, keep learning. Don't let age define your possibilities. Though I do feel that sometimes. I'm very my daughter's like, you should be doing all this. You shouldn't feel that way. And ask yourself like a simple question: what kind of impact do I want to have? And you don't have to have every step figured out. I surely don't. Still going through the transformation of myself and transitioning. And sometimes that next chapter of your life begins with simply having that courage to take that first step. And just, looking into something different. If you're passionate about something other than, IT or education, look into that. It shouldn't always matter about, salary and all that. I know that's an important factor, but at the end of the day, I'm learning that, something that is rewarding, makes you feel good, also challenges you, scares you a little bit, it's going to keep you going. And I believe in, keeping your mind and your brain active and learning. So hopefully that will help someone someday.
Hopefully so, because I guess there's no more, how do I put it? Like, the biggest pity I would have is for people who are stuck in their work that they hate, but they can't drop it. So yeah, it's super important to remember that you can always learn, and it looks like we have just one life. So also worth remembering about that.
That's right. Like that's why it's important to, like, you don't want to look back. And I always talk to my daughter and talk to myself, like, I don't think I've ever looked back and made a leap to make a change and regretted it. Right. So I never want to look back at an opportunity. And maybe I have maybe one or two. You can always have that, right? But I don't want to look back my entire career and say I should have done something. But it's never too late. But there's going to be a time where you want to, have that time for yourself too. So I'm, maybe 10 years, maybe even 15 years out to, continue to work in some capacity, but not as many hours or so. So at some point, I'll go through another transition, another transformation. So for me, it's never ending.
Great. Okay, John, I was super happy to have this discussion with you. Thank you very much. I wish you best of luck on your mission, on your educational mission, and the impactful one as well. But first of all, I wish you to have a lot of rest during the summer, to come back to school fully recharged and ready for new challenges and new questions.
No, I appreciate the time and you inviting me to talk. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay.